Around the late 90s and early 2000s, a little wave of popular Japanese horror movies released that you probably never heard of until there were American adaptations. 2000's The Ring began as Ringu in 1998, followed by 2004's The Grudge, which originally released as the straight-to-video Ju-on The Curse. As far as horror movies go, the original Japanese versions of those two are some of the most contextually mild examples of the genre. They're less like straight-up horror and more like procedural detective stories whose investigations involve ghosts and demons and stuff. The Americanizations of these films got PG-13 ratings, which is pretty uncommon for horror, but started an awful little trend for the next couple years that might have actually begun with the T-rated gamification of these movies, in the form of 2002's Fatal Frame. Unlike your usual Resident Evils and Silent Hills, this was a Japanese horror game not made for the Western audience first. It also must have been the hardest T rating the ESRB ever issued. There's not a lot of jump scares, and the player won't shed a single drop of blood or gore, but the disturbing situations and extremely oppressive horror atmosphere here are a testament to how the age rating on the box hardly correlates to just how bad a thing's gonna scare the kids. Even though it's rated one notch higher, Resident Evil is a Saturday morning cartoon compared to this game. These less extreme Japanese horror movies have a kind of made-up authenticity to them, to compensate for whatever scares a screen full of slimy body parts can't convey. Ringu ended its theatrical run to enter the VHS rental market with a story about a cursed videotape. 2005's critically acclaimed Noroi is lauded as one of the best examples of the found footage fake documentary subgenre. And what Fatal Frame has going for it is that it's based on a supposedly true story. The game's setting and plot borrow from the stories of the real-life Himuro Mansion, said to be one of the most haunted sites in Japan. Some say visitors can still smell the scent of bullshit to this day. Because for as long as I looked into it, I couldn't find any actual newspaper articles or historical documents backing up the claim that this place actually exists. As it turns out, the American localization team stamped the mention of a true story onto the box just by themselves. The game has nothing to do with any kind of true story. You got a fake attempt to connect it with real life, ghosts who haunt the living by way of some kind of technological visual media, ghosts who have long black hair and white clothes because that's what Japanese ghosts have looked like for hundreds of years, and also something about closet cabinets. I don't know what it is about Japanese people being spooked about closet cabinets. I mean, I can get the creepy little girl thing, that scares white people too, but for some reason all of these movies and this game have major scenes taking place in or around closet cabinets. So as far as Japanese horror games go, Fatal Frame is just about the Japanesiest of them all. It was also kind of an early PS2 tech demo. It was kind of a Resident Evil clone, and it was also kind of an example of the diminishing lineup of publisher-backed middle-market Japanese games, which in retrospect seems to have been a luxury of developing for the best-selling games console of all time. It's a niche Japanese B-list in-house import whose graphics and production value were still pretty cutting-edge. And that's a segment of the American market that nowadays has less of a diversity of culturally distinct imports in favor of games made either by Westerners or by the Japanese for Westerners. The rising costs of development have seemingly bled over into the cost of localization as well. Console gaming is not going to feel as vibrant as the PS2 days when getting timely English language releases of Yakuza and Mother 3 are apparently these huge financial struggles. So Fatal Frame represents a hole in the English-speaking market that is there now but wasn't there back then. Localizing the latest one was apparently enough trouble that they didn't even want to print boxes for it. But 12 or so years ago, you could always find 1 or 2 copies of this game on the shelf at any given Blockbuster, sometimes next to Mr. Mosquito and Guitaro Man. PC development is really affordable nowadays. There's weird stuff all over that platform, but that just makes it harder to remember that 10 years ago there was much more room for experimentation in mainstream gaming than there is now. Some of the most brave and bold games didn't look too far behind the tech used in mainstream hits, and sure, developers nowadays can do far more with less, but let's not forget that the sappy little emotional games as art gem from 2005 was Shadow of the fucking Colossus. Anyways, what Fatal Frame actually is an early PS2 survival horror game in which you fight ghosts by taking pictures of them. And the reason why I said it was kind of an RE clone earlier is because despite its incredibly different take on combat, atmosphere, and tone, its level design is so totally RE. You spend the whole game in one mansion, quickly sweeping through all its main rooms in the first hour or two, before spending another 5 hours backtracking through them all again to chip into new ancillary rooms located around the perimeter, with a growing keychain of notched puzzle items unlocking your way there. The whole concept of photographing ghosts for combat is the draw here. That's the elevator pitch feature that is so bizarre and out there that it's just enough to let Fatal Frame stand on its own as a unique pillar of the classic survival horror franchise. But it would take it a while to get there. In the first game, your camera Obscura turns the game into a kind of hybrid first-person shooter, with our double-stick FPS controls being slow and unwieldy to keep things nice and spooky. Combat is a really abstract process. Charging up magical spirit energy by maintaining a lock on ghosts increases the damage each shot does. Which is why you can't just fire off bursts in their general direction like you have a machine gun. That'll just use up ammo, which is film, on shots that do little to no damage, which is your spirit energy charge. It's a system that's wacky and interesting to look at, but doesn't play with enough tactical possibilities to really feel like a worthwhile life-improving pursuit. The camera Obscura may not be an actual gun, but it sure controls like one and is just about as much of a security blanket as one. Ghosts rarely attack you in groups in the first Fatal Frame. Only about 2 or 3 encounters in the whole game have them thinking to gang up on you, which means that in almost all the other encounters you just backpedal away before firing off a shot once they get close. A powerful shot will stun them, set them back further, rinse and repeat until complete. So with a bit of first-person shooting in your Japanese horror comes a kind of backwards sense of pacing and difficulty compared to its Resident Evil roots. There is no lock-on button, and the amount of shots a ghost can take isn't fixed, so survivability depends on the player's own aim, not the item placement or level design put in place by the developers. It's a situation where the game developers can't really drop the mathematically perfect amount of ammo here and there because they have to account for the player missing or misusing a whole bunch of their shots. Like when you have to solve a puzzle, because you just shoot puzzle items with the same ammo you shoot monsters with in this game, and that's actually how you solve puzzles. This eats up a hell of a lot more ammo than the genre conventions, which means there's kind of an abundance of ammo throughout the whole game, which means there's less tension, which does make the ghosts a bit less of a threat. It all looks fantastic, though. The high detail but low-res 60 frames per second mansion is still lit and laid out beautifully. The heavy post-processing used on these ghosts may no longer be as much of a tech demo as it once was, but the process of shoving your small field of view in and out of their attack range incorporates the anticipation of a jump scare into your gameplay maneuvers. It's a brilliant example of video game horror, even if the mansion is a few notches too small to fill up 7 hours, and if any given example of your ghost photography combat is playing it way too safe and easy. Which the developers must have picked up on, because in the mid-game there are a few enemies whose movement and attacks just seem to hit where you're not looking, no matter where you're looking. And that's one of the reasons I had to unlearn that survival horror habit of saving ammo and running past slow zombie roadblocks. Because in this game, the ghosts will chase you through walls, through rooms, and sometimes half the mansion to hit your backside with a rubber-banded damage multiplier that just makes the chase not worth it. There's plenty of ammo to go around, plenty of monsters you can't go around, and you've got FPS controls to pop off high damage charge shots, so just plow through them. As far as the past and the present are concerned, Fatal Frame is a cool little game, but not exactly a watershed moment. But that doesn't mean it's aged poorly. Without a huge resurgence in tank-controlled Japanese horror, there hasn't been much in the way of innovating on this type of gameplay to fairly compare it to. The very same movement control scheme can be seen almost verbatim in Until Dawn, and in that case it would have felt like more of a throwback if they still didn't work just as well. And that's why Fatal Frame doesn't feel as old as it is, but it doesn't feel truly excellent either. And it wasn't considered to be back in the day. It was, and still remains, a highly competent and entertaining RE clone, and it's still one of the more dreadfully chilling horror games around, but it was by no means a milestone of its genre. But that didn't discourage Tecmo from making a sequel. Even though Fatal Frame wasn't, and would not ever be, a top-selling franchise, they managed to go big for a sequel that had a CGI budget, friendly AI, a hell of a lot more voice acting and music tracks, and enough confidence to take a stab at a hard M rating. The jump in quality, going from 1 to 2, is obvious. Just about everything feels more polished to some degree, and the combat system has been drastically expanded and changed to address nearly everything that wore out its welcome the first time. You're fighting multiple ghosts in the very beginning of the game at encounter number 2. Distance is now your primary multiplier for increasing damage, not time, which means you have to balance the risks and rewards of putting yourself close to danger to take down ghosts efficiently. Regular shots build meter for special moves, enemies have 2 degrees of counter frames in their animations, there's even a combo system. Suddenly, photographing ghosts got really complicated, but not too much to feel overwhelming. There's depth to it now. There's enough of a necessity to pay attention to what you're doing to make it feel like a worthwhile game to learn. And you can tell, because there's a long list of challenge missions unlocked after completion. Instead of exploring one big mansion, you now travel through a handful of smaller mini-mansions connected by a foggy village overworld. If anything else, the level design is now closer to Silent Hill, but with this wacky ghost photography thing now being so deep and complex on its own, Fatal Frame no longer feels like an RE clone or a Silent Hill clone or anything else. It just feels like Fatal Frame. And I also really like the dreamy, melancholy tone of this game's overworld. You got pitch black skies and a soundtrack that's just wind chimes and trees rustling and nothing else. It's very Demon Souls-y, very otherworldly, a quality amplified by the camera's usage of negative space. That's a concession that the first game avoided entirely. It's subtle, but it makes the world feel just a little more disconnected from the world. The first game had characters from modern Japan rummaging around ruins from ancient Japan, but the second game has characters from no definitive time or place getting spirited away to somewhere in a netherworld void. There's no definitive time or place here. It just looks Japanese-ish, and you got an old camera, and that's really all you have to go on. And if it weren't for this annoying gray, grainy filter that washes out the blacks while making the whole screen brighter, I would almost go ahead and say it manages to set a stronger scene and be scarier than the first game, but the deeper black and louder soundscape of the first games are things that really unsettled me much more than anything in the sequel. But they're both great. Maybe not excellent, but still pretty great. But what's holding the second game back from really feeling like a timeless classic is a long list of minor issues with its level and combat designs. Although there's a much more diverse set of moves for both yourself and the bad guys, a lot of the enemy animations just kind of shat the bed. It's still hard to tell what's going on, what they're doing, where they're coming from. What? There's one type of enemy whose attacks and weaknesses are something I never really figured out. Your period of attack just flickers on and off super fast, totally unpredictably, and here's one lady who moves only by clipping through stairs. This is a game where the very technical difficulty of ghost movement is the whole point of what stretches out its combat situations. They can move through walls, under walls, over walls. What may be a startling graphical error to us mere mortals is just a tactical advantage for the undead. So your duty is to find clear open spaces to keep yourself from being ambushed, and the game designer's duty is to place them in areas where you can't only be ambushed, and sometimes it doesn't always work out. And last, but not least, is this big issue with how room-to-room transitions are very, very sudden. I really don't know how this one happened. I guess it must have been a workaround to keep the camera from clipping through your AI partner when you enter a door, because the first game's room transitions are delicious. They are silky smooth motions that are wonderful to play with, but the second game uses one hell of a jump cut instead. Suddenly, an open door is immediately closed. You're facing a different angle and the camera crosses the axis of action. It's jarring. The design of the last two houses is heavy on repeated wall panel textures and light on visual landmarks, so it's also disorienting and super easy to get lost. I found myself checking the map every few steps, and after every single door, and that time really adds up. And it's hard to say if it's worth that time going through them. The second game clearly has more going for it, and it's kind of a good old time, but either way, they never really shake the feeling of being cheaper, stranger spin-offs of the more refined and well-known examples of great horror games. But maybe that's what the genre needed back then, a bit of outlandishness and competition to help clarify what exactly the standard is and why it was the standard. Because nowadays, Fatal Frame is easily more of a real horror game than what Resident Evil eventually became. But apparently, having Tecmo throw around Fatal Frame amounts of money for experimentation now is much harder than it was back then. It's surprising to know that the series... It's actually very, very surprising to see this franchise last this long, because not a single installment of it has broken even 500,000 copies sold. It's a really weird franchise, one of the most niche concepts to last this long and garner this degree of appreciation, and the latest installment is just now releasing digitally only in the US on a dying console a year later than its Japanese launch. Compared to the much faster English releases of 2 and 3, and then the complete lack of 4, followed by a year's wait for a half-hearted launch of 5, it looks like localization efforts for Japanese games have gone backwards. Dramatically. But with that in mind, I'm still hoping for the best. We'll see where this franchise has landed next week.